Our second scripture today is from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verses 1 to 13. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide. These three. The greatest of these is love. When was the last time you heard that passage read?
At a wedding.
At a wedding. Of course. Of course. It is the passage of choice at a wedding, isn't it? People who would never go to church, would never open a Bible, they read that passage at their weddings. Yeah. And it's a wonderful passage for a wedding. Because weddings are, obviously, they're all about love. There's that wonderful mix of new love, of lust, of infatuation, of dreams for a future, and all that stuff kind of intertwining. And then to have a passage in the Bible that just talks about love. And just... And not only for the new couple who's sitting there and holding that passage up and not really listening very carefully to it, but holding it up anyway and saying, oh yes, we love each other. And then the rest of us who are sitting in the congregation, especially those of us who've been in long-term committed relationships, we hear it a little more carefully and we go, oh yeah, hard work. And these promises that are being made today are serious ones. So that's where we hear that passage the most. We talk about love, though, a lot in the church, don't we? We talk about God's love for us. And you know, I pick the songs every Sunday, and it is really easy to pick good songs about God's love for us. There's a whole slew of them. Last week we sang one of my favorites. Alexis chose it actually for last week. Your love surrounds me. Your love surrounds me now. Well, God's love. Yeah. And that's, you know, I think of that passage from the scripture. In Him we live and move and have our being. And that is, we exist in God's love like fish in water. We sing about it a lot. And we sing about the ways that we love God and how we're supposed to express our love for God. And we sang that one today that we've only sung a few previous times. The King of my heart, the one I love. Yeah. So the passage obviously works for weddings, and it likely even works a bit for God's love for us. We could read through that passage again and say, well, yeah, God's got to have long suffering to be in love with me. But there's more to it than that. And I think if we put it in Paul's context with the way he meant for it to be read, it really doesn't have anything to do with weddings or with God's love for us. Paul was writing here about the hard work of relationship in community, in the church. About being God's people together when it's not easy. Corinth was a city that was surprisingly like modern cities. It was on a major crossroads of a trade route, and so it was a stopping point for sailors, merchants, traders from all over the world. And all those people and all those different cultures found themselves there. It was wealthy and cosmopolitan. In a time when almost every ethnic group found their way to that city. Obviously, all the different classes were there. It was a time of incredible religious diversity. They were all there. All nationalities, backgrounds, understandings of the way the world worked. They were all together interacting at Corinth, trying to make money. Unlike most places in the ancient world, it was a city, because of that, where you had at least some possibility of social mobility. With some hard work and a lot of luck, you might be able to move up the social ladder a little bit. That didn't happen anywhere else. And all of that led to interesting competition and friction and tension between all of these different kinds of folk. You take all of that stuff and move it into this new fledgling church called the Church at Corinth. The same dynamics and expectations found their way with the same incredible diverse mix of people, of abilities, backgrounds, class, and even religious backgrounds and religious understandings. Because when these folk came from some other religion, they still brought that baggage with them, and they placed it on top of what they were learning about Jesus. And trying to figure out how to mix all that stuff together. And they still brought that same competitive edge with them. Each person thinking, I want to wield power. I want to find a position of privilege and influence. And if there was opportunity in the wider culture, there was more so in the church. Because the church begins with this baseline understanding that in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. All of the social barriers are gone. So all of these folk who at least in society had a little bit of possibility of moving up, they come to church and hear, even though I'm a slave out there, I can be the preacher here. Even though I'm a woman and no one listens to me in my culture out here, suddenly in this place I can be a person of power and influence. And all of that stuff is starting to push and pull. And at the same time, there still are those who are saying, wait a second, you're a slave, sit down. You're a woman, I'm not going to listen to you. And all of that's going on in the church in Corinth. And the competition and the tensions all find their way to the forefront. They argued over who is the most spiritual. They argued over who is the most important. They argued over who would control the future of the church. They even argued over who had been the best apostle. Well, I was saved under Paul. I was saved under an apostle. Jesus himself spoke to me. And on they went. Add to all of that this lack of understanding of different cultures, because we all know how that goes, don't we? And suddenly, because I don't quite understand how you do what you do, and did you see what they had for... He had menudo. Do you know what's in that? We don't eat that stuff. And so there were hurt feelings. And the church at Corinth, with all of these competing factions, looked as if it was always on the brink of splintering into the First, Second, and Third Baptist churches of Corinth. instead of being one church together. And Paul responds to that. And he responds with his familiar argument where he compares the church to a human body. And he says the various parts of the body all stick together and they all rely on each other. And you can't say that one's more important than another or better than another because they all have to be there. And then he continues with today's passage with this lofty argument about love. That love is what holds that whole body together, allowing the church to be what it's supposed to be, alive and active in the world. And if he implies the members of the church are willing to live for each other, willing to be long-suffering, bearing all things, believing all things, hoping all things with and for each other, they will experience the fullness of God's kingdom. And he says, the gifts, all this stuff you're fighting about, that's all temporary. It's all temporary. None of you have all of the right answers. Even the most spiritual and in touch with the Spirit still see everything dimly. The most woke of you still find yourself sleepwalking much of the time. Love, he says, is the one thing that can hold it all together and can remain even after the need for all of these gifts has evaporated. When I preach this passage at weddings, I always say to the partners who are being married, it's an impossible definition. And again, those of us who've been in any long-term relationships, as we listen to it, we know, yeah, that ain't going to happen. Certainly not all the time. So I tell the couples that it is an impossible definition, but sadly it is also the only one that works. Because unless we strive for that, unless we try to live with that kind of love, there's no hope in the world that the couple will make it. Without it, the relationship is doomed. Because there are those inevitable times when the other person, and it's always the other person, right, is going to be less than what they need to be. And the frictions will come, and the problems will come, and all of those issues will face us. And sometimes it's not even going to be the other person, it's going to be stuff from outside that comes in and causes it. And sometimes you're going to look at that other person and you're going to think for a second, why? Who is that? That's not the person I committed myself to, and indeed it's not. Because we all change through time. And all of that goes on, and we know that it's impossible. And it requires, if the couple is to make it, that self-outpouring love. But we need to remember here that Paul's not talking about marriages. He's not talking about that kind of a couple here. He's talking about the church. He's talking about this disparate group of Corinthian Christians living together when the tensions that they're facing as a church would be so much easier to just say, you know what? I'm going somewhere else. Or if worst comes to worst, I'm just going to sit in bed on Sunday morning. Maybe I'll watch the news. Maybe I'll sit there with the paper and a nice cup of coffee. But I don't need that. It's too hard. And you know that person. We're not going to say who it was. We're just going to look in their direction and whistle. Those of us who are old enough knew that reference, right? You remember Archie Bunker? Sitting at the table, and he said, I'm not going to say who it was, I'm just going to look and whistle. Anyway, it would have been so much easier. It is so much easier. Say, you know what? I'm done. I'm walking away. And don't get me wrong. There are toxic people in the world that we need to walk away from. There are toxic relationships that we need to walk away from. No question. And all of us have been in those situations. And there are times because of self-care that we have to leave. And that's another sermon that we almost never hear in churches, and we need to hear it more. And I need to preach that one about self-love. We talk about loving God and we talk about loving each other, but we never talk about loving ourselves. And that one's one that we need to do more with. And I'm aware of that. It's coming. It's coming. Sometimes we need to walk away for our own spiritual health and even for our physical health. And I'm not talking just about violent relationships, although that clearly is one of them. But there are times when our relationships are just so toxic that it impacts us physically. And we need to be aware of that. But at the same time, we can't forget that Paul keeps us on the hook here. He keeps us on the hook. He sees the pain and the hurt and the difficulty in community, but he also sees that it is in community that we most deeply and profoundly and intensely experience the presence of God. I believe in my heart of hearts that Paul would tell us that you can't be the Christian that you're supposed to be if you're not part of a community of faith. In spite of how hard it is. In spite of the fact that all of the rest of them people, they don't know how to be Christians. And if they would just listen to me, they'd get it right. But until then, I still have to hang in there with them. Because it is in community that we find opportunities for growth and service and for helping others grow and serve. And sometimes, usually, almost always, growth involves friction and pain. And that's just the way the universe works. And all of that means that as people of God in the community of faith, we're called to love each other with the kind of love that Paul describes here in this passage. And if it is impossible for a couple who have made a lifelong commitment to each other, it's at least as impossible for those of us who are sitting here who, while we clearly have made a commitment to each other, to be part of each other's lives, we're not quite that far along yet. I read this passage and I can't help but see my own failings in that love. My own places where I need. The times and places where I really, really, really need all of you to look past my faults. Not to look past my faults. To see them. And still say, you know what? It's okay. To hold me in your arms and look at everything you know about me and still in the balance say, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to work on this together. Pastors, if we find ourselves in a unique place, there aren't. I don't think there's any other slice. There's no other calling in our society that has quite the same access that pastors have. We see people at their very best and at their very worst, sometimes at the same time. We get to be there when the big decisions are made, when frightening times are endured, when dreams are dashed, when hopes are fulfilled in ways that other folk don't, except those who are the closest to it. And I've been really, really blessed to experience that with you. And today I want to thank you for allowing me to be there in those times. Thank you for trusting me with that intimacy. And as soon as I say that, I know that I have not always been as loving, as attentive, as caring as this passage would call me to be. And I promise to strive to be better at that, and I ask your forgiveness and your understanding, your love, when I fall short. I see that our society needs that love today probably more than at any time, at least in, well, maybe not, but needs it really, really badly. because we are attacking each other and we are judging each other. And it is so easy to just turn away when things get difficult. How many of us at the holidays saw all of those articles that said, here's what to do when you're facing going to the Thanksgiving table with your family members who are on the other side of politics. And if worse comes to worse, on Christmas Day there's always a Chinese restaurant that's open. And Paul reminds us, hey, love. Love. Because it is that love that can hold us together, especially when the tensions are there, especially when the misunderstandings are so big that we don't know how to get past them any other way, especially when we feel like we're living in different universes. Paul says, I don't care about any of that. What I care about is love. And love abides. And it is the greatest of those characteristics that will last for eternity. I wanted to read a couple of those verses one more time, this time from a different translation from the Message, where it says, love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut, doesn't have a swelled head, doesn't force itself on others, isn't always me first, doesn't fly off the handle, doesn't keep score of the sins of others, doesn't revel when others grovel, takes pleasure in the flowering of the truth, puts up with anything. Trust God always. Always look for the best. Never look back. Love never looks back, but keeps going to the end. That's Paul's word for us. For us. All of us.